Day 7, September 22nd, 1862, Emancipation, Washington, D.C. For the Union, the war was not going well, for most of Lincoln's generals had been a disappointment. After battles at Bull Run and Shiloh, where Confederate forces scored heavily, feelings of doubt about wisdom of the war are already being expressed in the North. At the same time, Lincoln is moving steadily toward a huge political risk that could be a greater disaster than any single battle. While the rest of the party debates if, when, and how to end slavery, he has decided to do it himself now. That decision could split the country again and drive more states into the Confederacy. Borderline personalities. Lincoln has already tried many times to end slavery and thus end the war by offering money to the slave owners. He has been tiptoeing around this explosive issue because he doesn't want Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia, the Union slave states known as the border states, because they border the Confederacy, to switch sides. If he loses those border states, the North will probably lose the war. Washington, D.C., which is surrounded by Maryland and Virginia, would immediately be cut off from the rest of the Union. Even one state can make a difference. I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game, Lincoln has said. If that state were to switch, others would probably follow, and the South would also gain a route to the northern cities near the Great Lakes. The governments and large numbers of citizens of the border states are highly sensitive to any move by Lincoln that interferes with what they believe to be their rights, especially with regard to slavery. Lincoln had already spends a lot of time trying to keep the border states happy. It isn't easy. When one of his generals announced a military order declaring emancipation for all the slaves in the Confederate states of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, Lincoln overturned the order to avoid angering the border states. A few months before this day, he invited senators and representatives from the border states to the White House to urge them to accept his latest offer to buy the freedom of slaves. In a firm voice, he rebuked their failure to support his earlier offers. You of the border states hold more power for good than any other equal number of members, he told them. If you all had voted for his proposal to buy slaves freedom in the gradual emancipation message of last March, the war would now be substantially ended. As long as the border states allow slavery, he reminds them, the South will believe they'll switch sides and join the fight against the Union. That hope is keeping the South in the fight. By conceding what I now ask, you can relieve me and much more can relieve the country, knowing that they fear among free African Americans. He promises that they do not have to free all the slaves at once, and he will make it easy for freed slaves to resettle in other countries. But the border state politicians are no more interested than before. That's when Lincoln had to act alone. Fortress of Solitude. The war itself seems to have changed Lincoln's attitude toward the presidency. He believed Congress was principally responsible for the actions affecting the public. Now he sees too many decisions that must be made by the country's chief executive rather than its elected representatives. When the war began, Lincoln was more likely to defer to the opinions of his advisors and generals, but he has learned that the reputations of some exceed their abilities. Lincoln has now begun to take more direct control of military operations. This decision about slavery, he concludes, is simply an extension of the country's military efforts, not a constitutional battle between state and federal governments. He has prepared carefully for this moment. The month before, while waiting at the telegraph office for the news of the latest battles, Lincoln began making notes for an emancipation order. The superintendent of the office, to whom he gave the pad of paper each night for safekeeping, later remembered he would look out the window for a while and then put his pen to paper. But he did not write much at once. He would study between the lines, and when he made up his mind, he would put down a line or two and then sit quiet for a few moments. After time, he would resume his writing, only to stop again at intervals to make some remark to me or to one of the cipher operators as a fresh dispatch from the front was handed to him. This he did nearly every day for several weeks. Sometimes he would not write more than a line or two, and once I observed that he put question marks on the margins of what he'd written. Soon after the document was finished, at an earlier meeting of his cabinet, Lincoln revealed his plan. Secretary of the Treasury Chase, the most avid abolitionist, asked for stronger language about bringing free slaves into the Army. Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General, who was more moderate, worried that the proclamation would cost the Republican Party seats in the upcoming congressional elections. But it was Secretary of State Seward who made the most interesting point. "I approve the proclamation," he said. But the depression of the public mind, after so many losses on the battlefield, may make it look like the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help from the government to the slave population. Seward was suggesting postponing it until after a better result in the battlefield. Lincoln later said, "The wisdom of the view of the Secretary of State struck me with great force. It was an aspect of the case that, in my thought upon the subject, I had entirely overlooked. The result was that I put the draft of the proclamation aside, waiting for a victory. That victory, or something close enough to one, came at the Battle of Antietam, just a few days before this day's cabinet meeting. In a single day of fighting that saw 23,000 soldiers from both sides wounded or killed, the Union Army stopped a Confederate invasion of Maryland. Although Union General George McClellan failed to pursue Robert E. Lee's army and possibly finish the war, the North considered it a win for its side. Lincoln had his opening for the Emancipation Proclamation. The time has come. On this day, he has called a special cabinet meeting for noon. The members, some who once considered him a little more than a backwards lawyer and inadequate to the job of president, now hear the words of a confident leader. "Several weeks ago, I wrote to you an order I had prepared," he reminds them, "which on account of objections made by some of you was not issued. I think the time has now come." Before anyone can voice an objection, Lincoln makes clear he is not interested in any further discussion about whether or not the document should be released. He is only open to suggestions that improve it. There is a steely edge to his words. Others might say it better. He acknowledges, "But there is no way in which I can have any other man put where I am. I am here. I must do the best I can and bear the responsibility of taking the course which I feel I ought to take." With that, he orders the public announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. The terms of the proclamation are complicated. Under the picture on page 97, Lincoln announces the proclamation to his cabinet, left to right. Edwin Stanton, Salmon Chase, Gideon Welles, Caleb Smith, William Seward, seated, Montgomery Blair, and Edward Bates. It does not simply free all slaves throughout the Union and the Confederacy. Instead, it once again extends an offer of compensation, but declares that any state that persists in rebelling when the new year begins on January 1st, 1863, will lose any protections it might have under the Constitution, including slavery rights. Ironically, this means that the Emancipation Proclamation does not free the slaves in the Union's own slave states. For that reason, its usefulness has often been questioned. But most reasonable historians conclude that this truly is a crucial moment in the war. The Emancipation Proclamation is the first step toward establishing the new basis on which the country will exist when the war ends. The war won't merely stop the Western expansion of slavery, it will abolish the institution altogether. The proclamation will also clarify the North's relations with foreign countries. The United Kingdom and France, for example, still profit from business ties with the South, and the continued economic support of the United Kingdom especially is crucial to the Confederacy. But these nations have both abolished slavery, the United Kingdom much more recently, so when the war becomes not merely a legal crisis between two slave nations, but an effort to end slavery in both the Union and the Confederacy, popular support from the United Kingdom and France will swing immediately to the North. This will lead to serious financial problems for the Confederacy, which needs European money to continue the fight. In the North itself, many people, perhaps even most, will welcome the proclamation. They've been fighting to end slavery all along. Others, however, will fear that the freed slaves will move north and take their jobs. But as the magazine Harper's Weekly admitted when it considered the question of the proclamation, even though at the present time a moral antipathy for the Negro is entertained by a large class of persons at the North, the war was leading to a remarkable change among many people. Soldiers in the field, who a year ago really believed that slavery was the true station for the Negro, now, after seeing the conditions of the slavery firsthand and living among the African Americans, freely expressed what used to be called abolition views. The real question, the editor suggested, was how long will it take for these liberal views to permeate society and stamp themselves on the mind of the working class? Unfortunately, that question could still be asked more than a century after the Emancipation Proclamation, but this day marks one giant step forward. Under the picture on page 101, Lincoln meets with General George McClellan in the General's tent headquarters at Antietam, Maryland in October 1862. Admired for his ability to train soldiers, McClellan had risen far above his ability to command. But he imagined himself the most capable man of his generation and constantly blamed others for his failures. His disrespectful attitude toward Lincoln, his commander-in-chief, had been apparent from the moment he took command of the army. He sometimes refused to meet with the president and even ignored Lincoln when the president took the trouble to find him. At the time of the meeting pictured here, the battle had already taken place. McClellan was unwilling to follow Lincoln's orders to pursue the retreating Confederate forces, an action that might have ended the war. About a month later, long after McClellan had lost the confidence of Lincoln's colleagues, Lincoln fired him.